Thank you. Before lunch, we'd turned to modes and frequency of training, and we'd spoken about scenario-based training and training of that sort. I'd like to move on and ask you for your thoughts on e-learning, so online learning. We've heard evidence in the inquiry about, for example, Moodle training within Police Scotland, which is an online training programme that they have introduced. And we've heard from a number of witnesses, including Graham Dursley, way back on day 42 of the hearing, that this is a compulsory course, and it's all done online on the computer. And you're aware of that training programme. Thinking about Graham Dursley's evidence, first of all, which is in March last year, he said that I asked him if this could be done within police hours, or is it done outside police sort of hours, and if it's done outside, were they paid for that? And he said, I don't think they will be. Some of them sometimes do extra Moodle. You know, sometimes I have sat and you work on it maybe an hour or two just to get it done, to make sure you're doing that. But you won't necessarily do that. However, at the same time, we're trying to give officers time to do these Moodle courses. But again, it's not easy to fit it in. You have to be honest and say it's not. And I'm interested in any thoughts you have about online training as a means and a method whereby officers, for example, are trained and given information about things like equality and diversity, race discrimination, that type of thing. Have you any thoughts on online learning?
Online learning clearly has value depending on what is it one is trying to get over, what you want people to learn. And how factual the learning is as distinct from matters which necessarily are more discursive. In one sense, it's a poor comparison, but it's almost like quantitative and qualitative methods of research or whatever. You can quantify certain things. You can demonstrate that you know the elements of a particular practice or whatever, and you could be tested on that once you're given the information. But for matters which, as we were discussing before lunch, require interaction, both in order to enable people to express and share meanings, concerns, understandings, or for that matter, to gain guidance. Online training is not appropriate. So it really does depend. I mean, you can do, if you're wanting to pass your driving test, you can do the theoretical bit of that stuff online, and you either know it or you don't. In relation to matters of racial discrimination or gender discrimination or whatever else it may be, there are too many nuances involved in that, and there are too many things which people need to test out themselves and be given assistance with for online training to be useful. Maybe when AI kicks in with a vengeance, it might be different. But um, in relation to what we're talking about right now, I would say one has got to be very careful as to which parts of training you do online.
We also heard evidence from Sir Ian Livingston,
Yes.
former Chief Constable, on day 113 of the inquiry in June, 20th of June this year. And he was asked to look at an interim report that had been prepared by the Equality, Diversity, Inclusion and Human Rights Independent Review Group. They're known as the IRG. And it was a report that was given to the Scottish Police Authority in May of last year. And he was, we quoted part of this report on training and development to him and asked him for comments. I'll read this out to you. We can't have it on the screen. It's actually from the evidence. And then I'll ask you some questions about it, if I may. So the quotation from the IRG report at that time on training development read, "The use of self-directed learning via Moodle was almost universally criticised amongst those we have spoken to. It was repeatedly referred to as a tick box approach and easy to work around. While it was seen as having some value in relation to technical or factual matters, such as changes to legislation, it was considered to have little or no value in relation to raising awareness of EDI HR issues and driving changes in attitudes and values." So that was a quotation from the IRG report. And Sir Ian was asked about that in evidence, and he said that there was scepticism about it and resistance to it, which he thought at times was unfair. He said, "Properly put together, there is a role for e-learning and our ability, as I have said, to deliver across a third of the UK landmass to each and every member of our staff, but that needs a level of flexibility. So we needed to continue it. We needed to make sure it was more engaging, improved as a quality product, and that it was supported at the right time, face to face, where you have got more of that personal intimacy that can develop training." He said, "E-learning and remote training, I don't think the challenges around that to make sure the product is fit for purpose is not confined to policing, but it's something, again, that I think is legitimate for us to continue to have used it, but to make sure it was appropriate and at times also implemented face to face. People delivering the training would probably start with that because as everybody knows, you're on a training course. One of the things you get at the end of it is giving us feedback, what was good, what was bad." He spoke about that in the context, obviously we remember COVID-19 and lockdown and training being delivered, maybe not in a face-to-face environment. And obviously he's talking about delivering training across what is a third of the UK landmass within Police Scotland, which is the second largest police service in the UK, as we've been told. So do you have any thoughts about that evidence from Sir Ian, or any comments that you'd like to make in addition to that?
I mean, I could understand the difficulties in terms of physically getting people together to facilitate the interactive training, which I am preferring, so to speak. But I really do believe that the downside of online training has got to be understood. It could have a very negative impact, and it could engender cynicism on the part of a lot of people. By that I mean dismissing it as something you could get around, to use the words of that report, or seeing it as a task to be accomplished. And once you accomplish that and you tick the box, you know that you've done it, so to speak, and it could be taken into account in someone assessing the amount of training you've done. What that does not do, obviously, is to interrogate how you learned in the process, how you're applying that learning, and the stuff we talked about earlier today, which I don't need to repeat. So what I would say about it is that it is appropriate for training where people are required to remember facts or a set of procedures and can tell you what those are, why they are important in terms of occupational practice or whatever else. But for as far as I'm concerned, that's about the limit of their usefulness.
We've heard from an Andrew Mitchell way back on day 35 of the inquiry on the 1st of February 2023, and he said he was very kind of old school. I'm a very kind of old school face-to-face teaching from when I taught at the university. I think online Moodle packages have their place, i.e. distance learning and things like that. But in policing, it's quite hard to keep track on how much degree of knowledge is taken in. And is that sounds like that's a concern you have about how much are people actually taking in if they're doing online courses?
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially if there are no means in the process or at any stage of actually testing that.
And can I ask about modes and frequency of training in relation to organisations such as PERC or Crown Office? Would you have similar concerns about online training as a method of delivery in relation to those organisations as opposed to the police?
Well, again, if the training is about equality, diversity issues, or about the policy context of equality and human rights legislation, for example, that requires so much interaction. It has to be discursive. All right. I could devise a training course, an online training course, where I take people through the evolution, if you like, of anti-discrimination legislation in this country, and give them some facts. There was an organization called CARD, the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination. In the middle 1960s, it did XYZ that led to the enactment of the 1968 Race Relations Act, etc. People could go away, memorize that stuff, and maybe be able to reproduce it back to you without too many errors. I could then go on to talk about the 1976 legislation, what the general duty meant, what specific duties were, etc., which were articulated in the 2000 Race Relations Amendment Act and so on. So you can do all of that, and people can gain factual knowledge. But if, whether it be in Police Scotland or COPFS or PERC, you want people to talk about how that informs their practice, their decision-making. What are the pitfalls they can see in carrying out investigations? against that background, what should people who are the investigators, especially lead investigators, what should they know? What should they be bringing to the process? Um, that's a different matter. And you might outline a number of things to do with all of that, which people again can learn. But I would suggest that that would be of pretty limited value if you can't, within a group, especially at that level of investigation, or being investigators, if you can't bounce off things on one another, have your assumptions on which you would base certain judgments and decisions questioned, and so on. So again, I would repeat that online learning is best in dealing with more mechanistic things and acquiring factual knowledge about this or that. But in relation to dynamic situations, such as are assumed at least and covered by race, disability, gender, discrimination, and so on, you require something much more challenging than that.
So when we think about limitations of online learning, it would not provoke discussion, challenge assumptions that perhaps existed. It wouldn't permit for questions to be asked and addressed, and it also wouldn't allow students to discuss real life scenarios and to address and share knowledge about how best to deal with those.
All of that.
Yeah. Okay. We heard from one of the lead investigators with PERC.
Yes.
On day 82 of the inquiry, February of this year, and he spoke about training within PERC. And we talked to him about PERC investigations and following the procedural requirements in terms of Article 2 of the Human Rights Convention. And he said that that type of work, that investigatory work, was integral to PERC and the investigations they carried out. And I asked him, is that something that is trained to staff when they join PERC? And he said, I don't know whether you would actually call it trained to staff, because we have an induction process for all new staff, but that is largely to teach them the way PERC operates, HR and all that sort of stuff. But if they join investigations, if they do not have previous experience, certainly we walk them through our processes and the reasons for it. A lot of it becomes on-the-job training, but they certainly become aware of it very quickly. So, and I'd like to ask you about this idea of on-the-job training, because we've heard from witnesses in PERC at that time who've talked about training, but I think if I can summarise it, it's quite limited. And there was an attitude that many of them were former police officers and would have been trained with the police, maybe with legacy forces or Police Scotland. And there was an emphasis on the job training. Do you have any comments to make about that as an approach to training in the area you're working in?
It's very important for an organization to be able to say with a high degree of accuracy what individuals have been trained in, the training that they did before, how it was done, what they learned from it, what they think they're bringing from that past role, or roles into the new situation. What disturbed me, having read the perk stuff, was that it was being assumed almost, without actually stating so in terms, that by virtue of having been with the police or with the army or army police or whatever, individuals would come equipped with the necessary skills, orientation, background to do investigations in PERC. I am not quite sure that unless you scrutinize in granular form what that past training experience was, the context in which it was done, and what have you, you could assume that however stellar their achievements might have been, people who join in PERC as investigators have the right orientation, knowledge, understanding to be able to do the job that they're being asked to do. It's assuming too much is what I'm saying. And if the public are to have confidence in PERC as an organization, it needs to be assured that when something serious arises, or whatever it is that PERC does, PERC itself knows that the people who are actually carrying out those investigations have got the knowledge, the understanding, the competence to be able to do that.
And do you think that, or have any views on the idea that on-the-job training, either from fellow colleagues or from just the experience of carrying out an investigation, do you have any views on whether that would be sufficient to fill a gap where a gap existed on training? And I'm thinking, of course, of equality and diversity, inclusion training.
Well, it won't be sufficient in my view. It could help. That is assuming that, for example, lead investigators in a team have themselves reflected on those issues sufficiently, and not just relying on the fact that they themselves went through equality and diversity training. I mean, it's more complex than that, it seems to me.
So if their fellow investigators had not had training or significant training in that area and had not sufficiently reflected, would that also cause you concern about the ability of that on-the-job training to plug that gap of knowledge?
Indeed, it would, because in my view, on-the-job training is not enough to fill a vacuum. It can help you build upon something, but fundamental principles are important. If I don't know the first thing about maths, and it's questionable if I do, sending me to an accountant as an understudy to do somebody's tax returns, etc., might teach me a certain amount of stuff, including how to handle stress, but it need not necessarily equip me to do the work of an accountant. In other words, what I'm saying is that basic principles are important. Understanding the context within which you're doing what you're doing is important. And that context is societal. It is to do with, for example, the historical relationship between communities and the police, whether they be working class communities, white, and the police, or communities in which there's a tremendous amount of substance abuse, communities with a drugs problem or whatever it is. So context is very important. And the context gives rise to the work quite often. The context helps to create the parameters for PERC's work. And to understand that, to me, is critical. Where that understanding comes from, how it is engendered within the organization, and how individuals are equipped to be comfortable in their knowledge and understanding, clearly become crucial issues.
Thank you.
And so what I'm saying is that to configure training, its purpose, its content, its intended outcomes, its methods, you've got to take all of that stuff into account.
So we also heard from Mr. McSporran on day 84 of the inquiry, 27th of February this year. And he spoke to an inquiry statement that he'd given to the inquiry, paragraph 167. And you were asked if you had had any training during your time at PERC in relation to investigating an allegation where race was a factor in the conduct of Police Scotland. And his answer was, I had no specific training on this matter. Now, you've talked about identifying the functions of an organisation. We've talked about PERC, their investigations into the actions of the police. Do you have any thoughts yourself about where PERC and their investigators are carrying out an investigation into the death of a black man who died after restraint by the police, where the lead investigator had no specific training on investigations where race was a factor? Does that cause you concern?
It causes me a lot of concern.
Can you explain why?
As I said before, the way in which individuals experience groups and institutions in society is critical. What we know about the relationship between the police and different sections of the population is important. Police Scotland, PERC, we all stress the importance of trust and confidence in the police by the public. We stress that routinely, and for good reason. It's the basis on which Peel and those who came after him determined that policing as a function could take place in a sustainable way within society. So therefore, the assumptions that police officers bring to their interactions with black people, there may be different assumptions for black women rather than black men. There are all kinds of issues to do with the way black men are perceived in terms of build, strength, stature, aggressiveness, all sorts of things. And some of them are pretty damaging stereotypes. An investigator must be able to look behind the actual facts. This person was restrained, power was used, tasers were applied, whatever it is, and be able to understand the scenario in which that is actually happening in relation to how confident the officers felt about what it is they were doing, whether they were using those props, so to speak, or tools for ensuring their safety, as a result of their stereotypes about the individual subject, or because they did not have the skill and competence to de-escalate, assuming that the situation lent itself to de-escalation or whatever. And you've got to make all of those sorts of judgments. In another case that I'm dealing with currently, I was surprised to find an investigator saying, a lead investigator saying, there is no evidence that the officers concerned used racial slurs or discriminatory language in their interactions with this person, and therefore race cannot be considered to be a factor. Now, I was I was not just concerned, I was distressed about that, because for a lead investigator to be able to say, unless somebody is calling somebody else a nigger or a wog or whatever else it may be, or using some other racial slur, there can be no evidence of racial motivation, is simply stupid. Now, how would an investigator know that that is stupid? They need to be able to understand the entire context of racism and how it manifests within society at the levels I describe in the paper, at a structural level, a cultural level, an institutional level, at a personal level. And gain an understanding of all of that in order to be able to come to some judgments, or at least to test your assumptions about what was actually happening in that situation. Common sense, because it is not so common, is not enough.
And can I just add to anyone listening, you're using these words as examples to explain your reasoning.
Yes.
And we don't want to cause offence to anyone who may be listening, of course not.
I understand that.
So am I right in thinking that if you are looking at designing a training program, say for example for an investigator who may be asked to deal with an investigation where race is or could be a factor, that your thoughts are that it would be absolutely essential for that person to be trained in so they can understand the full context, so that they can look at the influence that stereotypes may or may not have played, what part they may or may not have played in that incident. And that if training is to be designed, it should be designed to help the investigator do their job better. But what would be the mode or the method of training that would best allow that to be done? I mean, we've talked about online training. We've talked about lived experience training. We've talked about scenario-based training. Do you have any thoughts about the best type of training that could be put in place to help a future investigator investigate the death of a black man after coming into contact with the police?
Well, let me say this. Thankfully, the roll call of, within brackets, deaths in custody, I have problems with that designation.
Yes.
The roll call about deaths in custody or deaths after contact with the police involving black people in Scotland is not as gruesome as it is in England, thankfully. But that's all the more reason why there should be some evidence of Police Scotland and the Scottish judicial system generally learning from and engaging with what has been going on in England since David Olawale was killed by West Yorkshire Police in 1969. And why am I saying this? It's easy enough for Mr. McSporran, and I read his evidence, to say, well, people may have been trained in their other roles before they joined us. That's an assumption we're making. Or that this sort of thing hasn't happened before, and there is no way anybody could conclude that we do not have the skill and the capacity to deal with it, even if it is the first time or whatever it may be. Each of these organizations, COPFS, PERC, Police Scotland, should see themselves as learning organizations. England is not North Korea, thankfully. And it is just down the road, right? And as far as I'm aware, Scotland is still part of the British Isles. So, if you have Cynthia Jarrett, Joy Gardner, Roger Sylvester, whom I was related to by marriage, and so many, you heard from Sean Riggs' sister, Marcia, and so on. And Deborah Coles could give you a longer roll call than I can from Inquest. If you have all of that stuff going on, and each of these incidents, events, being investigated by the IPCC, International Police Complaints, Independent Police Complaints Commission, and its predecessors, and then its successor, the Independent Office of Police Complaints, IOPC, then surely whatever investigating team operates in Scotland should be connected with, I'm not saying that the methods should be identical, but they should be connected with the story of how these events are unfolding in England. And there's enough evidence of that. So there is no excuse, in my view, for PIRC not to know what the contentious issues were in each of those that I have referenced, how they were dealt with, what issues, what training issues did they give rise to, what legal issues did they give rise to, and how can we in Scotland make sure that were such events to occur in our territory, we've learned something from all of that, can train ourselves better, prepare ourselves better, and the contours of our relationship with Police Scotland, with the prosecutors, could be such that we are confident about a level of understanding among the three bodies. I mean, you know, it's not nuclear science.
So is it fair to say that the key is to learn lessons from these other investigations where people have died? And regardless of how the method of delivery of that training is ultimately completed, But the key is to learn the lessons and not simply not discuss them or not talk about them or ignore them completely.
Absolutely. And among those lessons, are the frustrations of the communities involved. It matters that there is a United Friends and Families group that Marcia Rigg is one of the leading members of. It matters that the black and global majority community in the South, in England, consider it appalling, if not totally scandalous, that in all of these deaths since 1969, and there's been hundreds of them, there's been only about 2 successful prosecutions of police for misconduct, or whatever else. In other words, in my own experience, there's been a process of normalization of this thing called deaths in custody, which the whole society has been party to, has learned to live with. And it is totally unacceptable.
Thank you. And you mentioned there the 3 organisations. Do you see a role in the future for training that may transcend those organisations or bring them together so that there is shared learning between the police, PERC and the Crown, and not simply have training in silos for each individual organisation?
Well, clearly, the training has got to relate to the function of each of those 3, obviously. For all the reasons that we've rehearsed already today. But it is important in relation to some of the matters that I've just been sharing with you, with inquiry. It's important that to grow that level of awareness and common understanding, that those 3 organizations are able to come together, train together, examine those issues together, and see how it relates to their respective functions. I think that's quite important. And if this inquiry leads to one thing, I would hope it would be that there is an understanding that these organizations cannot work in their own individual silos, but need to grow their awareness of what is happening across Scotland generally in the criminal justice arena, and particularly in relation to the relationship of the respective ones of them to the growing black and global majority population there is here. When I first started working here over in Oktarmakti in 1975 or whatever it was, doing medical research, the demography of Scotland was very different. Perth and Dundee even then were pretty monoracial. Glasgow was different for a variety of historical reasons. But what I think I'm saying is that one can't continue as public bodies as if the presence of people of the black and global majority community is simply an aberration or a temporary irritation or inconvenience. It therefore requires a level of reset, review, adjustment, so that everybody could be confident that they are able to deliver a service of equity to every section of the population. And that's particularly true of schooling and education, as it is of criminal justice and employment and whatever else.
Can I ask you about some evidence we heard from Mr. John Logue, now the Crown Agent at Crown Office? And this was on day 96 of the inquiry on the 23rd of April this year. And he described some training materials that they had in Crown Office. He said, Crown Office had and continues to have a range of guidance materials on equality, diversity and inclusion available on its staff intranet. There's a knowledge bank these talked about, available to staff in Crown Office, which contains documents that can give guidance or advice to members of staff in the roles that they're performing in Crown Office. And he talked about diversity awareness training in 2004, and he talked about this in his inquiry statement at paragraph 108. And I asked him to tell us a little bit more about that course, the diversity awareness course. He said, my recollection is that that was a training course that was established by the organisation and was mandatory for all staff. If I'm remembering correctly, it was part of the service's response to the failings in the Chokar prosecutions. Yes. And the 2 reviews which had followed that. Now, we'd heard other evidence about the reviews. One was carried out by Sir Anthony Campbell, and one was carried out by Raj Jandu.
Yes.
You're aware of those. And it was important that every member of staff in the organisation understood the findings of those reviews, understood what needed to change in the organisation, and also that staff were given what I might describe as the fundamental training on the issues of equality and diversity in terms of dealing with the public, in performing our duties, as well as aspects of how that also would impact on equality within the workplace. So it was a broad range of issues, but it came out of, I think I'm right in saying, given the timing, it came out of those reviews to do with the Chokar death, his murder. Can I ask you for any thoughts you have about that as a description of training within Crown Office? And any concerns that you have about that?
The reviews, as far as I'm concerned, were very helpful. And the care with which both authors carried out their work, I would have thought would have been very beneficial to the Crown and indeed Police Scotland. It seems to me that two things need to happen in situations such as those. One, an understanding of the reasoning within the report that led to the particular findings and recommendations. Because that takes you back to the evidence on which those findings and recommendations are based. And secondly, the ability to do the organizational review, interrogate the organization, not only to see the link between its continuing practice and what is in the report, but to find ways of organically using the findings and recommendations to bring about improvements. So before one could actually start implementing the recommendations, one has got to go back and really review how the organization is configured, what it is doing, what its current training programs amount to and result in, and how, therefore, having looked at all of that, mapped it and understood it, one could best and more productively apply the recommendations that are made in the reports. Now, the sense I get in all of this is that organizations talk about time and time constraints, and in some cases, maybe in all cases, resource constraints. But then you can't be sanguine about your competence, your competency, your ability to be efficient and successful in your dealings with any disparate group of people or events. If you don't go through that process, it is a strategic function, and it has to relate to your strategic priorities and how you determine those priorities, it seems to me. So what was described by Mr. Logue is in my view pretty important. However, many weaknesses in the end that might have been found to be involved in that. It's quite important. It's important that the organizations took that approach once they had the reports available to them, because having read them pretty carefully, I mean, I knew about the Choker case for God knows how long, but I found the reports to be particularly helpful.
So you do see merit in an organisation learning from reviews or reports which directly impact on their work?
Sure, absolutely.
And although there may be flaws or failings in relation to each individual course, the fact that they're rolling out training in relation to that is beneficial and useful for that organisation to do.
Yes, indeed. And I would like to think that there is evidence of that in the way, you may come on to it later, in the way family liaison officers were trained after Dr. Rando's report.
Yes, I think we've heard evidence in the inquiry about Dr. Jandu's report, primarily in relation to family liaison, and that in itself did lead to certain changes,
Yes.
Positive, beneficial changes in that regard.
Yes.
Can you give me a moment, please? I'm conscious it's now nearly 3 o'clock.
We'll take a 15-minute break. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Professor, before the break, we had been discussing a number of issues regarding training, but I'd like to move on now to the frequency of training. And you talk about this in your statement to paragraphs 40 and 41. So I think if we could bring that up on the screen. And you'll see that the inquiry team asked you about your views as to the frequency of training. I want to link that to what I've said about evaluation and how training needs are identified. In most staff appraisal schemes, there's a section where the individual line manager makes comments about the person and whether they believe that that individual would benefit from this, that, or the other kind of training. And it's always very useful because the individual line manager, if she or he is diligent, can see the potential in individuals and might actually encourage them to go into this area of leadership or whatever, and might want to signpost them to the appropriate training to enable them to get there. So is this another element of that appraisal or assessment from leadership, from leaders in the organisation, to identify potential?
Yes, it does that. It also sends a message to the individual member of staff as to the extent to which what they do is evident and appreciated or validated. And it also demonstrates, if you will, the organization's commitment to developing its staff and working in that holistic way to ensure that people can bring their best and do their best so that organizational goals could be met.
And you follow it up at 41 by saying individuals themselves might say, having been through this experience, although I think I benefited from the training we had 9 months ago, I think it'd be very valuable for me to hook into a training programme at this point. So it allows that process of self-reflection and analysis of their own needs and their own requirements and maybe things that can benefit from them from.
That's right.
Can I ask you for some comments about evidence we've heard about frequency of police training? Mm-hmm. And again, because I'm reading from a transcript, it won't appear on the screen. It came from a witness called Mr. Payton on day 20 of the inquiry on the 21st of June 2022. And I had asked him how confident he was, looking back on how confident he was about the training he'd received, particularly in relation to equality and diversity and matters relating to race. And he said, I think it probably could be improved if I'm being honest. Maybe every 2 years or something like that would be handy. Done for the right purposes and for the right reasons, I think they probably could do more. Because, I mean, I've heard some people that's given evidence saying that their last input was when they were up at Tullyallen. That's what probationers, officers get. Well, that's not really acceptable in my opinion. And everybody likes a wee day out course, eh? So maybe more regular training. And he said, yes, but not rammed down your throat, not every year. Something like every 2 years would be more than enough, I think. Because he felt, to be honest, most of your learning is done on the job. I'm interested in any reflections you have on that evidence about the frequency of training in relation to equality, diversity and race-related matters. He's suggesting every couple of years, not every year, and he thinks more training is done on the job. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, let's take that in 2 bites. I believe this 2-year suggestion is very arbitrary. It doesn't relate to anything. It doesn't say what else is going on between in that 2-year gap. He talks about on-the-job training, but again, that there are no parameters put around that, and we've discussed that
Yes.
earlier this afternoon. I found it telling that he could use terms like not ram down your throat or whatever that expression was.
Yes, that's correct.
Because what he appears to be saying is you've got to do this thing in moderation. It's an add-on, and therefore you can't be spending too much time or requiring that other people spend too much time or resources on it. It seems to me a very odd statement for somebody to make. And it's pretty indicative of his thinking. So I don't want to repeat what I've said already in answer to your previous questions, but it seems to me that training has got to be seen on a continuum. And I indicated earlier what I thought the particular points of that should be. So those suggestions of Mr. Payton, I see to be pretty arbitrary and not really based on any evidence of why, if you had 2 years training, is going to be as beneficial as if you didn't have any follow-up training at all.
And so, in relation to not Police Scotland, but say, for example, PERC or Crown Office,
Sure.
would you also see training as not being simply an arbitrary period for frequency, but on a continuum and an ongoing basis, blended in with the type of work which has to be done by that individual?
Yes, and for one pretty obvious reason, which is that if you, as a manager or a senior leadership team, consider that training is important to the organization, developing staff, enabling them to meet organizational goals, and all the rest of it, you must want to monitor the extent to which that is actually bearing fruit, the extent to which it is being productive, in that it is meeting your objectives. Those who are being trained are satisfied that it is contributing to their professional development and the rest of it. So it's important that you have mechanisms in place to do all of that. And on that basis, determine what you need to change or not, as the case may be. And in that regard, this is why impact assessment is so critical. You need to be able to do an impact assessment on training and how it works for the organization. And that has a starting point. Why are we doing this? What outcomes do we expect? To what extent do the things which we put in place, the methods we use, the content, etc., enable us to meet those particular objectives? And in that process, doing the impact assessment, you then begin to identify gaps or weaknesses or strengths or whatever. And it is an iterative process. You could then use that to go back and plan or adjust or whatever else it may be.
So having or fixing training at perhaps an arbitrary frequency is not the best approach to making the biggest impact on people being trained.
Unless having had periodic set periods when you know you're going to do impact assessment, as I've just been describing, you then go on to use the results of those assessments to determine whether you want to continue with your training program, adjust it, change the timing of it, or whatever else. It has to be related to something. It can't be just arbitrary.
Thank you. And that may actually answer what was to be my next question, which is about something we've heard evidence about in this inquiry, about how memories can fade or memory fade. And we heard evidence last week from Martin Graves on the 2nd of October about that. And he said, yes, it's a skill and it's well documented within the sort of learning and development world. And that's why certainly for first aid training, for example, there's now a legal requirement from a health and safety to refresh that knowledge and those skills on a regular basis. Officer safety was no different. It was, it was written into the requirement that if you don't refresh and practice those skills, you're going to lose them. So would this iterative process and this impact assessment and training being done on a continuum basis help minimise the risk of memory fade or avoid the risk of memory fade?
Memory fade is an interesting concept. I'm not quite sure how helpful it is in this sense. And I think, I've made references to that already today. It's just training and accumulating knowledge about or understanding about this or that is not a banking process. You don't fill a vessel with stuff and expect to hold on to that and it gathers moss or evaporates and you need to reset it and fill the thing again. It isn't like that. That's not how human beings learn, especially when they're adults. Nor is it how learning is actually applied. So the idea of memory fade, I see like this. You can suggest that there are certain facts that you learn which you might forget. There are certain procedures that you learn which, if you have no cause to use them regularly, you might forget. But two things about that. One, I talked earlier today about the need for individuals to own responsibility for their own continuous professional development. And in that process, you can make sure that you do not forget. And secondly, because we're dealing with dynamic situations, things change. Procedures might change. Laws might change. Different acts get revised and amended and what have you. So it's a judgment as to whether you are training not to refresh your memory about what you've already learned, but to ensure that you are operating now in compliance with what applies legally now, or that you are having regard to some changed circumstances that were not anticipated before. If tomorrow Edinburgh was to find that there are many coaches arriving with refugees or orphans, for that matter, from Gaza, and that requires different responses by social services, by schools, by police, by housing, whatever, then that's a completely new scenario, and it would be important that you take stock of how prepared you are to deal with that as a new phenomenon. There are situations closer to home where you might have to do that. So it's having that overall understanding of what organizationally you need to be focusing upon, and being flexible enough in order to relate to these new events and do so competently, and support your staff so that they can adjust to those new events.
All right, thank you. I've talked a number of times about the evidence we heard last week from Martin Graves, who was the officer safety training expert that we heard from. He started his evidence in relation to a report he'd given, looking at 7 criteria that, from his perspective as an OST trainer, he felt should be in place for training, good training that was fit for purpose. And I'd like to ask you about these 7 criteria and see whether you also agree that these are important aspects of training.
Sure.
And I'll just go through these in turn. So this is his evidence from day 118 of the inquiry. And the first was that there should be an agreed and documented content. So the content of the training should be agreed, and that there should be standardisation and consistency there. He was talking about a situation where there had been a number of legacy forces, which became Police Scotland on the 1st of April 2013, and that there should be content that was agreed, standard content going forward. And do you think that is something that can be of benefit if his concern was that individual trainers were perhaps teaching things that were not part of the agreed manual, or teaching ancillary matters which had not been found in the manual? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Again, it's one of my it depends. By that I mean, if the starting point is that now these legacy forces are rolled into Police Scotland as one composite entity, and Police Scotland is required to provide evidence of, for example, compliance with equality and human rights legislation, anti-discrimination and human rights legislation. Then the training, irrespective of what went on in the individual 13 legacy organizations, should actually reflect that and reflect the outcomes that Police Scotland wants to see. And in that respect, it would not help if, for example, Fife were doing its own thing, whereas the west of Scotland was doing something completely different. In other words, there are common factors to do with evidence of compliance, which should be evident across the piece. So when the chief constable or whoever else is giving an account of their leadership and management of the equality or equality and diversity agenda, they know that they can ask each part of the organization to provide evidence based on a certain set of criteria, and that would then satisfy her or him that Police Scotland is actually doing this right, and it is coupling compliance in the way that I'm just talking about with what I said earlier about the twin objective of building and sustaining a culture of equity. Yeah? So in that situation, clearly, yes. But then, given the topography of this region of Britain, there clearly are issues to do with rural policing, urban policing, and issues of, for example, interface with traveler communities and so on and so forth. And the way in which one meets those particular needs specific to a particular region or particular groups of the population within that region have got to be the basis on which you begin to plan your training. So it cannot be a one-size-fits-all in this second respect. It has to be much more focused than that. So I would want to differentiate between the two things.
Thank you. I think you've touched on what he described as the second criteria, a methodology for delivery with set competencies to measure against. So how do you check the individual has achieved or has taken on board the information and can demonstrate the techniques that you're asking them to take on board? So a set of competencies around the physical skills definitely would. It is a must, and also a manner or a methodology of being able to test that the knowledge that they have been given around conflict management, for example, has gone in. So it's about having competencies, set competencies that can be measured. Any thoughts on that?
I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier on in the day about the other parts of the continuum. For example, what the purpose of supervision is by line managers, how that could relate to the needs of the individual as well as, obviously, the needs of the organization, and how the supervision function can support the spread of knowledge and good practice around the organization. So it's a matter of ensuring that these particular elements are there and are being addressed as part of the whole.
His third criteria was a recognised level of trainer competence to deliver the programme. And I think we have touched on this earlier today. He said the trainer is an important part of the process, an important part of the holistic approach. They should be trained to a recognised level, and that's not just teaching qualifications, but it's also skill levels. Is that something you would agree with?
I would agree with that.
His fourth criteria was a process of check testing and developing the trainers, and having a process in place where they're either annually or perhaps biannually brought in, visited, monitored, assessed, and given fresh information or any changes to the programme that has taken place. So not simply bringing the trainers up to a level of competency at the beginning, but ensuring that that continues to be reviewed in long term. Is that something you would agree with?
Again, that depends on the content of training and how the training is delivered. In some forces that I'm aware of, in England, Northern Scotland, there is a practice of trainers being handed manuals to go and deliver to wherever. They've got no particular investment in the product that they're going to deliver. And they're basically there to hand it over. People can make what they want of it, so to speak. And they know that they're delivering this in modular fashion in this week and that week, etc. Now that, so in other words, it doesn't really matter who is doing the delivery once certain basic criteria are met. What I think I was describing earlier on, especially if one is doing interactive work, is a level of understanding on the part of the trainer that enables them to engage with trainees, so to speak, in a manner that boosts people's understanding and confidence in managing their learning and interacting with others. So it depends on, as I said, content, how it is delivered, how uniform one wants that content to be, etc.
And does this reflect back on the evidence you gave earlier about organisations identifying people who have particular enthusiasms or talents or skills which can really enhance an organisation?
Yes, but even those people need, they might have all of that, but they could be pretty lousy trainers.
Yeah.
So they need training so that they can make the best of those skills and capacities that they've developed over time, and know that they're confident enough to go in front of a group of, I don't know, 30 people, 15 people, 50 people, and assist them in developing their knowledge and their operational skills and the rest of it.
His fifth criteria was a method of monitoring delivery. It's either having somebody at a local level who is responsible for monitoring and checking local delivery for officers, or a process whereby a central unit may go out and monitor the delivery of training at various locations. So he was talking about having either a central unit or local delivery where someone was monitoring how the training was delivered. Do you think that's a useful function?
Could be. Again, it depends on how the whole training function is configured, it seems to me. And who has responsibility for assessing training impact, providing guidance to people who want to build upon that training separately from formal arrangements. So if I develop an interest in X or Y as a result of the training I received, and I want to pursue that, and I want some guidance on that, do I find that trainer, or is there somebody else within the organization who can assist me in those sorts of ways? I think these are all, if you like, undecipherables which have got to be identified and addressed if you're going to have a holistic approach to training in its various forms within the organization.
Thank you. His sixth criteria was systems to review and develop the programme with access to independent sources of information and expertise. So systems to review the programme over time and to develop it and improve it over time depending on the circumstances, and to also access independent sources of information and expertise. And we talked about medical expertise that may be brought in to assist with officer safety training. There may be other elements of independent sources of information. Now, you've talked today about staff organisations, student organisations, other third party, in a sense, or separate organisations, even part of the bigger body. And do you find that criteria to be something that fits in with your views, that there should be that system?
I think the usefulness of that would depend to a large extent on how much it supports and assists the training model that I'm suggesting is important along that continuum. And it depends also on what particular training it is. I mean, if you were doing firearms training, for example, there are elements of that which you might want a wider body of people, not necessarily part of Police Scotland, to be involved with assisting you as a kind of, I don't know, steering group or reference group or whatever else it may be. That's one example. As you know, there is a large amount of evidence in relation to how knife crime is handled and issues of risk, etc., in that, given the extent of injuries here in Scotland. There would be no problem, it seems to me, in getting some people, some practitioners, some academics who are not police officers, but who have to deal with this as a health issue, community health issue, and a social issue, as well as a law enforcement issue, to come together and begin to think about what that would mean and what kind of training, therefore, might be offered, or how the current training might be tweaked. And it may be that is already being done here. I don't know. But I would see that as one example of people not part of the organization assisting it in being more competent at dealing with those matters.
His final criteria was someone responsible for oversight day-to-day and strategically. Would you see that as being part of, would you see that as being something that could be mirrored in relation to the sort of training you're talking about, or would you not consider that necessary?
But I would have thought that that needs to be somebody, ideally somebody pretty high up within the organization, taking responsibility for learning and development. Let's see, it's a division I've just created, right? Learning and development, and fitting training into that with all the ramifications I've just been talking about along that continuum, if one had somebody like that at whatever level, assistant chief constable, chief inspector, chief superintendent, I mean, or whatever, then one knows that it is a function, to go back to our earlier discussion, that is particularly important strategically to the organization realizing its goals. It's important for staff development generally, and it needs to be closely monitored in terms of applicability, achievement, success, funding, interrelationships between Police Scotland, PERC, cops, whatever. So it's, and I'm talking about the senior leader in that sense because it's very important, it seems to me, that the organization sends out a signal as to how critical that function is. So people don't simply say, well, you know, it's a two-day training stuff that we do twice a year or whatever it is, or once a year. And it doesn't really feature very much in terms of the decision-making within the organization.
We heard evidence from Fiona Taylor, who had said herself she had a particular passion for issues about equality and diversity and moving that forward within Police Scotland. And that she has, I think it was an Alan Spears who took over from her, but there's now been another ACC appointed, or DCC, Professionalism, Strategy and Engagement, I think was the original. Sorry, I may be reading this incorrectly. It's part of Policing Together. A Deputy Chief Constable, Alan Spears, has executive responsibility for professionalism, strategy and engagement. And we've also heard evidence that another officer has been appointed in relation to specific areas about engagement and dealing with equality and diversity. Is that the sort of level that you think someone could have the strategic role, have the authority to provide the leadership in relation to training on these matters?
Yes, I do. And I think the important thing is to an important function of the role must be to make the whole EDI agenda as streamlined, some call it mainstreamed, as possible. So it isn't regarded by staff or by anybody else as a sort of bolt-on to what is considered otherwise to be the organization's core business.
So it's a core issue to the organisation being successful.
That's correct.
And not just simply an add-on that people just have to go to a training course once a year
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'd like to ask you about one last thing before I move on to types of training. And it's some evidence that we've heard in the inquiry about how officers can be placed under stress when they're out responding to incidents in the field and difficulties that they may or may not experience, comparing complex thinking on the one hand and working at a high level of executive function compared to reactive or instinctive thinking, which they may default to in a stressful situation. And I wondered, we've heard evidence from a Dr. Peter Jones, who's talked about the brain and how it responds to processing capacity in a stressful situation, and how certain incidents can overwhelm frontal lobes of the brain, which will then fall back on the cortex. And the problem is with emotional or cognitive load, which eats up resources of the frontal lobe. So when stressed or in danger or rushed, we tend to fall back onto these implicit connections, making rapid judgments about people. And those judgments may be stereotypical. They may be racist tropes. Do you have any thoughts yourself about these issues, about the stresses that officers can be under, for example, when they're responding to an incident, and their ability to retain that training that they have been given, or the difficulties they may have with retaining that?
I looked at evidence of, I can't remember the name of the person, who was very exercised with that whole business about making judgments in stressful situations, and I think he used the term working by instinct rather than by more sophisticated cognitive processes. I have to say, I found that whole body of evidence which he presented to the inquiry very peculiar. And I think to a large extent, he was talking about the stress people are under in a situation such as somebody who is reported as having a knife. What concerned me about it was that, I mean, I don't know what qualifications Dr. Jones, Mr. Jones has. That whole neurodiverse, engineering stuff that he was talking about, I don't fully understand, and I have not tried to get my head around it in preparation for this, for this hearing. What I would say though is this, that coming back to something I said earlier on today, training isn't about banking. It's not about filling your head with all sorts of things which you then have to immediately compute when you get into a stressful situation. And the idea that you have a duality, so to speak, of on the one hand, things that people do through instinctive reactions, and things that people do through reflective thought in a less stressful situation, is very artificial if one is talking about police officers operating on a day-to-day basis. So I don't want to repeat what I said this morning, but it seems to me that it is wrong to construct some notion of what I call police fragility, and try and suggest that you need to protect the police from all sorts of situations that they might find stressful. And for example, in the case of somebody armed with a knife, don't assume that your pepper spray and your tasers would necessarily protect you. You would need to summon firearms officers in order to be able to deal with that situation. I found that evidence very strange. And so what I would say is, it is clearly important that police officers are trained in terms of risk assessment, threat assessment, risk management, and can determine on the basis of what they assess the risk to be, what appropriate forms of intervention there might be. Whether it be using of pepper spray or engaging tasers or using batons or whatever else it is. But the minute one gets into this business about, well, have they retained enough of the training that they did as a probationer to be able to guide them in terms of what to do in this stressful situation? And to what extent are they using all their cognitive skills as distinct from reacting instinctively to the situation in front of them? I don't believe that that helps police officers in any way at all.
So in terms of training and the training that can be provided, do you see that training can be provided and equip perhaps an officer in a response team with the skills to carry out actions regardless of stress? Or do you think there is a mismatch between training and actual performance in real life situations if stress is involved? Are you aware of any?
But I don't know. I don't think mismatch is the right term for that.
Okay.
I think it's a matter of, as I said earlier today, how training is received, how individual officers use that training and build upon it in terms of their own understanding of situations, and the mental work they do on how to respond in those sorts of situations. It's that dichotomy between following instinct and being cognitive and reflective that I find artificial in that regard. You can't wait for somebody to go through whatever these mental processes are. If you like, that's the antithesis of the other thing. If you're going to react in a situation where somebody is threatening either harm to the public, to themselves, or indeed to you, which is what I'm saying. It's a matter of bringing an understanding and an awareness that makes you feel confident about the judgments that you would make in those situations. That is what the training ought to achieve. It isn't about giving you factual knowledge that you then summon up, computer style, when you're in a situation that requires your instantaneous response.
So training, good training, would be about helping someone make better decisions more quickly. Is that fair to say? Rather than having to go through some cognitive process to think about their decisions.
Well, I mean, I think people are always thinking about their decisions. If you're going to apply tasers, you must firstly compute in your head that this is what you will do in this situation. This is why you're doing it. Whether you're conscious of Article 2 and Article 3 or not, this is what you're going to do. This is why you're doing it. You believe that it is essential to protect yourself or to protect an other or others, and you expect there to be a result. So there are thought processes involved in that. it's not like touching a hot kettle and pulling your hand away so that you don't, scald yourself or get burnt or whatever it may be.
And training about equality and diversity issues or race, can that play a part in that thought process about should I pick up my taser? Is it essential that you've been describing?
It is important. I mean, there are reports about the application of tasers breaking that down by ethnicity, by age, by whatever. And it is found, particularly in metropolitan London, that to a very large extent, tasers are used more quickly and more often in relation to interactions with black males than the rest of the population, proportionately speaking, right? And that may be for any number of reasons. So at least the training should enable police officers to engage with that kind of evidence, that kind of debate, to ask questions about what is known about the use of tasers in Scotland in relation to any section of the population. And to what extent has it proven to be a useful tool in terms of assisting to keep officers safe and so on. So there are issues around that. In other words, you're acknowledging that policing is taking place within a context, a community context, a societal context. And you're acknowledging that how these implements are used does go to the matter of trust and confidence in the police, or whether certain sections of the population believe the police are more aggressive in dealing with them than others, or whatever. And one has got to have those conversations, however difficult they may be. And then one has got to ask questions about whether people reach for tasers much too readily, much too quickly, and the use of them could always be justified. I mean, one has got to do all of that if people are going to be armed with those things to go out and interact with the public.
Thank you very much. Could you give me a moment,
Sure.
please? Would that be an appropriate time to...
Yes, we'll stop there for the night, and Professor John will continue with your evidence at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you, sir.